When a mobster tried to humiliate Dean Martin, Johnny Carson did the unthinkable. The night Johnny Carson faced down a mobster for Dean Martin. Something happened on December 3rd, 1973, that NBC never wanted anyone to talk about. It wasn't supposed to make the news. It wasn't supposed to become a story. The network buried it so deep that for decades, only a handful of people knew the full truth. But those who were there that night, standing in Studio 6B in Burbank, watching it unfold in real time, they knew they'd witnessed something that changed how they understood courage. This is about the night a Mafia boss walked into The Tonight Show taping and tried to humiliate Dean Martin on live television. And about the moment Johnny Carson, a man who'd spent his entire career avoiding confrontation, stepping out of every personal controversy, keeping his private life locked away behind a wall of professional composure, made a choice that risked everything he'd built. But to understand what happened that night, you have to understand the world these men lived in, the invisible rules, the unspoken accommodations, the careful dance between entertainment and organized crime that defined Las Vegas, and by extension, much of American show business in the 1960s and 70s. Dean Martin wasn't just a singer or an actor or a television personality. He was an institution. By 1973, he'd been famous for nearly 3 decades. He'd survived the dissolution of his partnership with Jerry Lewis, one of the most bitter breakups in entertainment history. He'd reinvented himself as a solo act, then as a member of the Rat Pack, then as the star of his own variety show. Dean Martin was untouchable, or so people thought. But fame doesn't make you immune, it just makes you more visible. Dean had a history with organized crime that went back to his early days in Steubenville, Ohio. Not a history of participation, but a history of proximity. He'd grown up around men who were connected. He'd performed in clubs owned by the mob. He'd taken their money, sung at their weddings, attended their funerals. This wasn't unusual. In the world of entertainment, especially in Las Vegas, you couldn't avoid these connections. The mob owned the casinos, they owned the showrooms, they controlled who performed and who didn't. Dean had always been careful, friendly but not too friendly, respectful but not owned. He understood the rules. You didn't disrespect them. You didn't refuse them outright, but you also didn't become their property. It was a delicate balance, and Dean had walked that line for his entire career. Johnny Carson understood this world too, but from a different angle. Johnny had built The Tonight Show into the most powerful platform in American television. His show could make or break careers. An appearance on The Tonight Show meant legitimacy. It meant you'd arrived. And Johnny protected that platform fiercely. But Johnny also understood that certain people, certain interests, had influence that extended beyond television ratings. He knew that men with connections sometimes made requests. Sometimes those requests were accommodations. A ticket to a taping, a brief hello backstage, small things easily granted that maintained a certain understanding. Johnny had always been careful too. He kept his distance. He didn't socialize with those people. He didn't owe them favors. But he understood they existed, and he understood that outright refusal could create problems. December 3rd, 1973, was supposed to be a routine taping. Dean Martin was scheduled as the lead guest. This wasn't unusual. Dean had appeared on The Tonight Show dozens of times. He and Johnny had an easy rapport. Dean would come out, tell a few stories, sing a song, promote whatever project he was working on, and that would be it. Professional, smooth. Exactly the kind of episode that made The Tonight Show the most watched program in late night. The taping was scheduled for 5:30 p.m. The show would air that night at 11:30, tape delayed for the East Coast, live for the West Coast. The audience started filing in around 5 p.m. Tourists, mostly. People who'd requested tickets months in advance. People excited to see Johnny Carson in person, to be part of the magic of television. But not everyone in the audience that night had requested tickets through normal channels. At 5:15 p.m., 6 men walked into Studio 6B. They weren't dressed like tourists. They wore expensive suits, dark colors, perfectly tailored. They moved with a kind of confidence that made the ushers nervous. These men didn't look around in wonder like the other audience members. They didn't smile. They walked to a front row section, and they sat down, and the ushers didn't ask them for tickets. Because you didn't ask men like that for tickets. The man in the center was named Anthony Castellano. Tony to his friends, Mr. Castellano to everyone else. He was a capo in the Gambino crime family. In 1973, at the height of his power, Tony Castellano was one of the most feared men in organized crime. He controlled gambling operations, loan sharking, labor racketeering. His reputation for violence was well established. People who crossed Tony Castellano disappeared. People who owed him money paid, or they suffered consequences that made payment seem merciful. Tony Castellano had come to Los Angeles on business. He had interests in several Vegas casinos. He had interests in Hollywood too, though those were never discussed publicly. He was in town for meetings, quiet meetings, the kind that didn't appear on any official schedule. And Tony Castellano had decided he wanted to see The Tonight Show. More specifically, he wanted to see Dean Martin. Tony had history with Dean, not friendly history, complicated history. Years earlier, Dean had performed at a casino that Tony had partial ownership in. There'd been a disagreement about payment. Dean's people claimed he'd been underpaid. Tony's people claimed Dean had been paid exactly what was agreed upon. The disagreement was resolved in the sense that Dean stopped performing at that casino, and Tony made certain comments about Dean in certain circles that suggested lingering resentment. But this was years ago. Water under the bridge, or so people assumed. Backstage, Dean was in his dressing room, relaxed. He'd done this hundreds of times. He knew the routine, hair and makeup, run through his talking points with the producers, wait for his cue, walk out, smile, be charming, leave. He had no idea Tony Castellano was in the audience. Johnny Carson was in his own dressing room, doing his own preparation. Johnny had a ritual. He'd review his monologue cards. He'd go over the guest list. He'd spend time alone, getting into the mindset of being Johnny Carson, the television personality, as opposed to John Carson, the private man who was considerably more introverted and anxious than his on-screen persona suggested. At 5:25 p.m., a production assistant knocked on Johnny's door. "Mr. Carson, we have a situation." Johnny looked up. The production assistant's face was pale. "What kind of situation?" "There are some men in the front row. They don't have tickets. Security tried to ask them to move, but they refused. One of them is Tony Castellano." The name hung in the air. Johnny knew who Tony Castellano was. Everyone in entertainment knew who Tony Castellano was. You knew who these men were, the same way you knew not to touch a hot stove. It was information that kept you safe. "Did they ask for Dean?" Johnny said quietly. The production assistant nodded. "They specifically requested front row seats. They said they're here to see Dean Martin." Johnny stood up. He straightened his tie. His face remained calm, neutral, but behind his eyes, you could see him calculating, thinking through options, consequences. "Does Dean know they're here?" "Not yet. Don't tell him. Not until I figure out what's happening." Johnny walked out of his dressing room. He didn't go to the stage. He went to the production booth, where Fred de Cordova, the show's director and producer, was already on the phone with NBC's head of security. "We can't remove them," Fred was saying into the phone, his voice tight with frustration. "You don't understand. These aren't regular audience members. These are connected people. If we try to force them out, we create an incident." Johnny walked up beside Fred. "Hang up the phone." Fred looked at Johnny, then ended the call. "What do they want?" Johnny asked. "I don't know. They just walked in and sat down. They haven't made any demands. They haven't caused any problems. They're just sitting there." "Have you talked to them?" "I sent an usher over. The usher came back shaking, said Mr. Castellano told him they're guests and they're staying." Johnny looked through the window of the production booth at the audience below. He could see Tony Castellano in the front row, center section. Perfect view of the stage. Tony wasn't looking around. He wasn't talking to his associates. He was just sitting there, waiting. "What do you want to do?" Fred asked. "We can cancel the taping. Tell the audience there's a technical problem. Reschedule." Johnny shook his head. "That creates its own problem. Word gets out that we canceled because Tony Castellano showed up. That makes us look weak. That makes it look like he controls us." "So we taped the show with him sitting there?" "We taped the show," Johnny said. "But I need to know what his intention is. If he's here to cause a scene, I need to be prepared." Johnny left the production booth and walked down to the stage floor. He didn't go through the main entrance. He used the side door, the one that crew members used. He wanted to approach the front row without making a scene, without drawing attention. He walked slowly down the aisle. The audience members were chatting, excited, unaware of the tension. Johnny reached the front row. Tony Castellano looked up at him. "Mr. Castellano," Johnny said, his voice quiet, respectful. "I'm Johnny Carson. I wanted to welcome you to the show." Tony smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "Johnny Carson, I watch your show. You're funny." "Thank you. I appreciate you coming tonight. I wanted to make sure you're comfortable. If there's anything you need." "I'm fine," Tony interrupted. "Good seats, good view. I'm here to see Dean Martin." The way he said Dean's name, there was something in it. Not quite a threat, not quite friendly. Something else, something that made Johnny's instincts scream warning. "Dean's always great," Johnny said carefully. "He's one of our favorite guests." "I bet he is," Tony said. "I bet Dean Martin is real popular, real charming. Everyone loves Dean, right?" Johnny nodded, not sure where this was going. "You know, Johnny, Dean and I go way back. We have history. I thought it would be nice to see him tonight, remind him of old times." There it was, the edge beneath the words. This wasn't a social visit. This was about something else, something unresolved. "Well, I hope you enjoy the show," Johnny said. He turned to walk away. "Johnny," Tony called after him. Johnny stopped, turned back. "You know what I appreciate about your show? It's honest. You ask real questions. You don't let people hide. I respect that." Johnny held Tony's gaze for a moment, then nodded and walked away. Backstage, Johnny found Fred and pulled him aside. "He's here to do something," Johnny said quietly. "I don't know what, but this isn't friendly. He wants to humiliate Dean. That's my read." "What do we do?" "We don't give him the opportunity. I change the format. Instead of Dean sitting on the couch for the full segment, I keep him standing. I keep the interview short. I control the interaction." "Johnny, if you obviously cut Dean's segment short, Castellano will know you're protecting Dean. That might make things worse." "Then I'll do it subtly, but I'm not giving that man a platform to humiliate one of my guests on my show." At 5:30 p.m., the warm-up comedian came out and started getting the audience energized. At 5:40, the band started playing. At 5:45, Ed McMahon walked out to introduce Johnny Carson. "From Hollywood, it's The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson." The curtain opened. Johnny walked out to thunderous applause. He smiled, waved, took his position behind the desk. He launched into his monologue. Jokes about politics, about the news, about everyday life. The audience laughed. Everything seemed normal, but Johnny could see Tony Castellano in the front row, not laughing, just watching. After the monologue, Johnny sat at his desk and did his usual banter with Ed McMahon. Then he introduced the first guest, a comedian who did a 5-minute set. The comedian was funny. The audience loved him. But Johnny kept glancing at the front row. Tony hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, just watching. Then it was time for Dean Martin. "Our next guest needs no introduction," Johnny said. "One of the greatest entertainers in the world. Please welcome Dean Martin." The band started playing That's Amore. The curtain opened. Dean walked out, smiling, waving, looking completely relaxed. He was wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Hair immaculate, the image of cool confidence. Dean walked to the desk. He and Johnny shook hands. Dean sat down on the couch, crossed his legs, leaned back, and then Dean saw Tony Castellano in the front row. Johnny watched Dean's face. The smile didn't falter. The posture didn't change. But something flickered in Dean's eyes. Recognition, and something else. Not quite fear, wariness. "Dean, great to have you back," Johnny said, steering the conversation immediately. "Always a pleasure, Johnny," Dean said smoothly. His voice betrayed nothing. "You're working on a new album, I understand." "That's right. Should be out next month." The conversation continued. Professional, smooth. But Johnny could feel the tension. Dean was performing now, not just talking. Every word was careful. Every gesture was calculated. Dean knew Tony was there. Dean knew this wasn't normal. And then, in the middle of Johnny asking about Dean's upcoming Vegas shows, Tony Castellano stood up. The movement was sudden enough that several audience members looked over. Tony walked to the edge of the stage. He didn't climb up. He just stood there, looking up at Dean. "Dean Martin," Tony said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the microphone. "Remember me?" The studio went silent. The band stopped playing. The audience didn't know what was happening, but they knew something was wrong. Dean looked down at Tony. His face remained neutral. "Tony, been a long time." "Not long enough," Tony said. There was venom in his voice now. "You owe me an apology, Dean. You owe me respect. You walked away from our deal. You made me look bad. You think you can do that? You think you're untouchable?" Johnny stood up from behind his desk. His mind was racing. This was live television, tape delayed but still. This was happening in front of 300 audience members. If he didn't handle this correctly, it would become a news story. It would become a scandal. But more than that, Tony Castellano was threatening Dean Martin on Johnny's stage, in Johnny's house. "Mr. Castellano," Johnny said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to sit down. This is a taping, and we can't have interruptions." Tony turned to look at Johnny. "This doesn't concern you, Carson. This is between me and Dean." "This is my show," Johnny said. "Everything that happens on this stage concerns me." The two men locked eyes. The studio was silent. 300 people holding their breath, crew members frozen in place, Ed McMahon standing off to the side, unsure whether to intervene. "Your show," Tony repeated, a hint of mockery in his voice. "You think that means something? You think that protects you?" "I think it means that while you're in this building, in this studio, you're going to follow the rules," Johnny said. "And the rule is that guests don't interrupt tapings, so you can sit down or you can leave. Those are your options." Tony smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "You've got guts, Carson. I'll give you that. Most people don't talk to me like that." "Most people aren't responsible for this show," Johnny said. "I am, and I'm telling you, respectfully, that you need to either sit down or leave." Tony looked back at Dean. "This isn't over. You and me, we have unfinished business. If you have business with Dean, you can discuss it somewhere else," Johnny said. "Not here, not on my show." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension was suffocating. And then, slowly, Tony Castellano nodded. He turned and walked back to his seat. But he didn't sit down. He gestured to his 5 associates, and together they walked up the aisle and out of the studio. The door closed behind them. Johnny stood there for a moment, then turned back to Dean. Dean was still sitting on the couch, his face carefully neutral. "Well," Johnny said, forcing a smile, "that was unexpected." The audience laughed, nervous laughter, releasing tension. But it wasn't funny. Everyone knew it wasn't funny. Johnny sat back down at his desk. He looked at Dean. "You okay?" Dean nodded. "I'm fine, Johnny, thanks. We can cut this segment, start over." "No," Dean said firmly. "Let's finish the interview." So they did. They talked about Dean's album. They talked about his Vegas shows. They talked about his children. Professional. Smooth, like nothing had happened. But everyone in that studio knew something had happened, something significant. When the taping ended, Johnny didn't go back to his dressing room. He went straight to Dean's. Dean was sitting on the couch, tie loosened, drink in hand. He looked tired. "You didn't have to do that," Dean said when Johnny walked in. "Yes, I did," Johnny said. "Tony Castellano isn't someone you confront. You have no idea what you just did." "I know exactly what I did. I protected a guest on my show. That's my job." Dean shook his head. "Johnny, you don't understand. These men, they don't forget. They don't forgive. You embarrassed Tony in front of people, in front of his own guys. That's not something he'll let go." "So what was I supposed to do? Let him threaten you on live television? Let him turn my show into a platform for intimidation?" "You were supposed to stay out of it," Dean said. "This was between me and him, old business. I could have handled it. By apologizing to him? By letting him humiliate you? By surviving," Dean said quietly. "You do what you have to do to survive. You apologize. You swallow your pride. You live to fight another day." Johnny sat down across from Dean. "I've spent my entire career avoiding confrontation, staying neutral, not taking sides. You know why? Because it's safe. Because it protects the show. Because it protects me. But tonight, watching that man threaten you, watching him try to use my show as a weapon, I realized something. Some things are more important than safety." Dean looked at Johnny. Really looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you're my guest. You're on my show. And nobody, I don't care how connected they are, nobody gets to threaten you in my house. That's the line. That's where I draw the line." Dean was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know he might come after you now." "Let him," Johnny said. "I'll deal with it." "Johnny, you're not thinking clearly. You have a family. You have a career. You can't afford to make enemies like Tony Castellano. I have a family and a career because I've built something that matters, Johnny said. The Tonight Show matters. It's not just entertainment. It's a place where people can come and be themselves and be protected. If I let Tony Castellano turn it into something else, if I let him use it as a weapon, then what am I protecting? What's the point? Dean stared at Johnny. You're serious. Completely. Dean took a sip of his drink. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest. Probably both, Johnny said with a slight smile. The episode never aired. NBC's legal department reviewed the tape and made the decision to pull it. They cited technical difficulties. They aired a rerun instead. The audience members who'd been there that night were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, offered free tickets to future tapings. Most of them signed. A few refused, but without the footage, they had no proof. Their stories became rumors, whispers. But within the industry, word spread. Johnny Carson had stood up to Tony Castellano. Johnny Carson had kicked a mob boss out of his studio. Johnny Carson, the guy who avoided controversy, who stayed neutral, who never took sides, had drawn a line. 3 days later, Johnny received a visitor at his home. Not Tony Castellano, someone else, someone representing certain interests. The meeting was brief, 15 minutes. When it was over, Johnny walked back inside, poured himself a drink, and sat alone in his living room for an hour. He never told anyone what was said in that meeting. But those who knew him noticed something different afterward. A wariness, a carefulness in how he moved through the world. Dean Martin called him the next week. They talked for an hour. Dean never appeared on The Tonight Show again. Not because of any falling out, not because of any public disagreement. He just stopped being booked. And when people asked why, the official answer was scheduling conflicts. But those who understood knew better. Tony Castellano never returned to Los Angeles for public events. He never attended another television taping. He continued his business, his criminal enterprise, but he stayed in the shadows where men like him belonged. Years later, in 1987, long after The Tonight Show had become a cultural institution, long after Johnny Carson had become the undisputed king of late-night television, a reporter asked Johnny about the incident. The reporter had heard rumors, wanted confirmation. Johnny looked at the reporter and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "There are people who say you once kicked Tony Castellano out of your studio." "Are there?" Johnny said. "People say a lot of things." "Is it true?" Johnny paused. Then he said, "Let me tell you something about this business. There are moments when you have to decide what kind of person you want to be, what kind of show you want to run, what kind of legacy you want to leave. Those moments don't come with a handbook. They don't come with clear instructions. You just have to make a choice and live with the consequences." So it is true. I'm saying that I've always tried to run a show where guests feel safe, where they can come and be themselves without fear. If there was ever a moment where that principle was tested, I hope I made the right choice. The reporter pressed for more details, but Johnny wouldn't give them. He never did. Dean Martin died in 1995. At his funeral, Johnny Carson attended, but didn't speak. He stood in the back, wearing dark glasses, watching as others eulogized one of the greatest entertainers of the 20th century. After the service, someone approached Johnny and asked if he wanted to share any memories of Dean. Johnny shook his head. "Dean and I understood each other. That's all that matters." But those who knew the full story understood what Johnny meant. They understood that on one night in December 1973, Johnny Carson had risked everything to protect Dean Martin's dignity. And in doing so, he'd revealed something about himself that few people ever saw. The man behind the jokes, the man behind the smile. The man who understood that sometimes courage isn't about fighting. It's about standing firm when everything in you says to step aside. The incident was never officially documented. The tape was destroyed, or so they said. The NDAs held. The rumors faded into legend. But in the hallways of NBC, among the crew members who'd been there that night, among the producers and directors who'd watched it happen, the story remained alive, because they'd seen something rare. They'd seen a man who'd spent his entire career avoiding confrontation decide that some things were worth confronting, They'd seen Johnny Carson draw a line and refuse to cross it, no matter the cost. And they'd seen what real courage looked like. Not loud, not aggressive, just quiet certainty. Just a man saying, "Not here, not on my watch, not to my guest." That was Johnny Carson. Not the Johnny Carson of the monologues and the jokes, the real Johnny Carson. The one who understood that fame and power meant nothing if you didn't use them to protect the things that mattered. December 3rd, 1973. The night Tony Castellano tried to humiliate Dean Martin on The Tonight Show. The night Johnny Carson shut him down. The night brotherhood defeated intimidation. The night that proved dignity is worth fighting for, even when fighting seems impossible. That's a performance worth remembering. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check